The smile that stretched too wide. It was the kind of night that felt like the world was holding its breath. No moon, no stars, only the oppressive blackness of a sky blanketed by clouds. The streetlights flickered uncertainly, as though unsure if they should bother staying on. My apartment, usually a haven of comfort, felt stifling. Sleep eluded me, chased away by a nameless unease that thrummed just beneath my skin. The air outside was cool and damp, carrying the faint metallic tang of rain that hadn't yet arrived. I wandered aimlessly, my footsteps echoing faintly against the narrow streets of my quiet neighborhood. I didn't know why I felt compelled to leave my home, only that staying inside seemed unbearable. It was then that I heard it, a soft, almost intimate chuckle, drifting from the shadows of an alleyway. The sound didn't belong. It wasn't the cheerful laughter of neighbors sharing a joke, or even the drunken cackling that sometimes spilled from late-night revelers. It was deeper, slower, and filled with a kind of quiet glee that made my skin prickle. I hesitated, the sensible part of me urging caution, but a strange pull, curiosity perhaps, drew me closer. The alley was shrouded in darkness, save for a flickering streetlight at its far end. As my eyes adjusted, I saw him. He stood unnaturally still, his body a silhouette against the dim, wavering light. His face was cast in shadow, but his mouth was illuminated just enough for me to see the grin that stretched far too wide. It wasn't just a smile. It was an exaggerated curve that seemed to split his face in two, his teeth gleaming like polished ivory. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth, almost melodic. "Isn't it beautiful to smile?" Something about his tone felt wrong, as if he wasn't speaking to me, but to some deeper part of myself. My throat tightened and I managed a weak nod, unsure of what else to do. The man tilted his head, the motion eerily fluid. "It's infectious, you know," he murmured, his grin widening, impossibly so. The words clung to me as I turned and walked away, my heart pounding harder with every step. I didn't dare look back. Yet even as I reached the safety of my apartment, the sound of his laughter lingered in my ears. The morning light did little to dispel the unease that had settled over me like a second skin. My reflection in the bathroom mirror greeted me with an unfamiliar sight, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It wasn't a pleasant expression. There was something off about it, an unnatural sharpness that made me look like a stranger to myself. I rubbed my face, splashed water on it, and tried to focus on brushing my teeth. But the smile wouldn't go away. Throughout the day, I caught glimpses of it in every reflective surface. The sheen of my coffee mug, the darkened window of a passing car. It was always there, faint but insistent, as though it had rooted itself somewhere deep within me. By evening, the smile wasn't just mine anymore. I was taking out the trash when I noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Gardner, standing in her yard. She was usually a reserved, soft-spoken woman who spent most of her time indoors, tending to her houseplants. But now she stood motionless beneath the shade of her oak tree, her face bathed in the warm glow of a porch light. She was smiling. The expression looked painful on her aged face, her lips pulled taut and trembling slightly at the edges. Her eyes, glistening with tears, met mine, and she opened her mouth to speak. "Have you seen him?" she asked, her voice a shaky whisper. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The man," she said, her voice cracking. Her smile remained fixed, but her hands began to tremble violently. "The one who laughs." Before I could say another word, A loud, high-pitched laugh erupted from her throat, harsh and grating, like the sound of metal scraping against glass. She clutched at her chest, doubling over, yet the smile stayed plastered across her face. I backed away, unsure of what to do. When I returned to my apartment, I locked the door and sat down, trying to make sense of what was happening. But no amount of reasoning could explain the grin that now felt carved into my face, or the laughter I could still hear echoing faintly in my mind. Night fell, and with it came the sound I had been dreading. Soft, slow laughter drifting up from the street below my window. I didn't need to look to know who it was. By the next morning, the smile was no longer a faint tug at the corners of my mouth. It had grown, stretching unnaturally wide, cutting into my face like a mask I couldn't remove. My cheeks ached from the constant strain, and my reflection had become a grotesque parody of joy. I avoided the mirror as much as I could, but it didn't help. The world had begun to change around me. Everyone I passed on the street, neighbors, strangers, even the cashier at the corner store, seemed to be smiling. Some looked uneasy, their expressions trembling as though they were struggling against an unseen force, while others grinned with an eerie calmness, their eyes hollow and unfocused. It wasn't just the smiles. Laughter followed me wherever I went. It began as faint echoes in the distance, but by midday, it was everywhere. Soft chuckles slipping through walls, disembodied giggles that floated on the breeze. When I confronted my neighbor across the hall about the noise, she simply stood there, smiling at me. "Isn't it nice to laugh?" she said before closing her door. Desperation drove me to my computer. I scoured forums and obscure websites, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. The pieces were scattered, fragmented accounts that spoke of a figure who appeared on dark, starless nights. A man with a grin so wide, it seemed to split his face in two. The stories were eerily consistent. It always began with a single encounter, a strange laugh in the dark, and then the smiles would spread like a virus. Victims would lose control of their expressions, their laughter becoming uncontrollable, until they either disappeared or, worse. One thread, buried deep in an old forum, claimed to know how to stop it. The key, it said, was confrontation. Find him. Make him laugh harder than he's ever laughed before. Only then can you break the hold. The words chilled me, but they also gave me a sliver of hope. If I could find him again, if I could face him, maybe I could stop this madness. As night fell, I prepared myself. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin. The streets were eerily quiet, the laughter that had plagued me earlier replaced by an oppressive silence. It wasn't long before I heard it again, that low, familiar chuckle. He was waiting for me in the same alley where I'd first seen him, his silhouette illuminated by the dim flicker of a streetlight. His grin was as wide as ever, stretching unnaturally across his face, and his eyes sparkled with a knowing glint. "You came back," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "What do you want from me?" His laughter swelled, filling the alley and spilling out into the street like a living thing. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about what you've already given me." Standing before him, I felt the weight of his presence pressing down on me like an invisible hand. His grin seemed even wider now, as if feeding off my fear. My body tensed, the unnatural smile on my face aching as I struggled to keep control of my thoughts. "You're feeding on this, aren't you?" I said, my voice trembling. "The smiles, the laughter, it gives you power." He tilted his head, a mockery of curiosity, and chuckled. Smart. But it's not about power, my dear. It's about joy. Pure, unfiltered, endless joy. His grin twisted, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. And you've brought me so much. The word struck me like a physical blow. I clenched my fists, grounding myself. You won't have me, I said. I'll fight this. I'll end it. He stepped closer, his movements impossibly smooth, like a shadow gliding over the ground. End it? He repeated, his grin widening. Oh, but the only way to end it is to win. Win what? A game, of course. The air around us seemed to thicken, the world narrowing until it felt like we were the only two beings in existence. Make me laugh, he said, his voice reverberating with a sinister edge. Make me laugh so hard I can't contain myself. If you can, I'll let you go. If not... His eyes gleamed, his grin stretching further than ever. Well, you've seen what happens to those who fail. I didn't have a choice. The weight of his presence bore down on me, and I knew this was my only chance. Summoning every ounce of courage, I forced myself to laugh. It started awkwardly, strained and hollow, but I pushed on. I thought of every absurd image, every ridiculous scenario I could muster. My laughter grew louder, more manic, filling the alley with a frenzied cacophony. His grin faltered ever so slightly, and for the first time I saw something flicker in his eyes. Confusion. I seized on that, laughing harder, louder, until my sides ached and my throat burned. It wasn't real joy, but it was enough. His grin began to waver, the edges trembling as if struggling to hold their shape. Enough! He bellowed, his voice booming like thunder. His form began to blur, his features distorting as the laughter dissolved into a deafening silence. When I opened my eyes, the alley was empty. The oppressive weight was gone, and for the first time in days, my face felt normal. But as I turned to leave, a faint chuckle echoed behind me, so soft it could have been the wind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. The oppressive laughter that had once haunted my every waking moment was gone, replaced by a brittle stillness that felt just as unnatural. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. I told myself it was over. The man with the impossible grin had vanished, his hold on me broken. My reflection in the mirror was my own again, the grotesque smile gone. I should have felt relieved, but instead, unease coiled around me like a predator, watching, waiting. It began subtly at first. Walking through the grocery store, I caught sight of a woman standing motionless in the bread aisle, a wide, unnatural grin plastered across her face. Her eyes were hollow, unfocused, staring straight ahead as if looking through me. I turned away quickly, my pulse hammering, and when I glanced back, she was gone. Later, as I sat in my apartment, I swore I heard faint laughter filtering through the walls, soft, rhythmic, and too familiar. I pressed my ear to the drywall, straining to listen, but the sound vanished the moment I acknowledged it. That night, I dreamed of him. The smiling man stood at the end of a dark hallway, his silhouette bathed in flickering, unnatural light. His grin stretched wider and wider, splitting his face until it was no longer human. His laughter rang out, deep and resonant, filling the endless void around him. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. My face was wet, tears, not sweat, and my jaw ached as if I'd been clenching it all night. The final blow came the next evening. As I stared out the window, trying to shake the unease that clung to me, I saw a child standing in the street below. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, her small frame bathed in the orange glow of the streetlight. She was smiling, an impossibly wide grin that sent ice coursing through my veins. She turned her head slowly, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. And then she laughed. The sound was light and airy, almost innocent, but it carried a weight that crushed the air from my lungs. It was the same laugh I had heard that night in the alley, the same laugh that had haunted my every step. I staggered back from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, a familiar warmth crept into the corners of my mouth. My lips began to curve upward, the smile tugging at my face once more. Somewhere, deep in the night, his laughter echoed. It was never over. It never would be.